Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook live broadcast. I'm Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. And today I'm here with our founding attorney, Louis Landerholm, to talk about what are often the most contested assets in a divorce. Hey, Louis, before we get started, how you doing?
Doing great. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing really great. This one I really like because whenever I talk with people, it's no matter what's going on, there's always some issue about one of these assets or more. And so kind of good to kind of get them out and talk about, just what they are and why they're important. So, I kind of chose five that we can talk about today: retirement accounts, marital home, business interests, investment portfolios, and then just other personal property that could be valuable, art, vehicles, that kind of stuff. So before we go through their individual kind of nuances, is there a common thread that tends to run through those kinds of assets?
Well, I think the biggest part with any of these assets is always valuation, right? And so when we're dealing with dividing the marital estate, the question becomes, what is the marital property worth? And so, for some of these, there are valuation questions, not necessarily like a retirement account, but more on the retirement account side. That's where people feel like, well, I earned that by my work, so why should I have to give, half of that to my soon-to-be ex-spouse? So that's kind of where it falls on the retirement account side. On a lot of the other ones, it really comes down to competing valuations, and that's always a place for there to be a fight. You've got a house, you can have multiple opinions on what a house is worth. You've got investment accounts. What's going to happen as during the pendency of the case? Are they going to grow? And then also with investment accounts, another thing that's in investment is like RSUs, restricted stock options, that companies will give. That's another big, contention. Like, how do we deal with that? And there's a case that deals with that as to the valuation of the future amount. And then obviously, personal property is and businesses are, they're all built on what is the value.
Yeah.
And so, there can be, do we need experts to do evaluation? Do we need, somebody to go through and just determine what is even there, especially if there's cash or if there's, hard assets like gold or silver or that sort of thing. So that's where the biggest contention comes from is, if it's marital, then how much is it worth?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Retirement accounts can always, to me, feel like they're can be different because a lot of people don't necessarily, I don't want to say understand what a retirement account is, but I mean, you could have an IRA, you could have a 401k, you can have a this, you can have a that, and even got Social Security coming up, and it feels like all of those need to have their little there's individual things about them that you need to know, and how it mixes with all the other assets. It's specifically like, how do you even value like a 401k?
Yeah, and that becomes an issue because 401ks, because they're pre-tax dollars, we typically have to agree on some sort of tax, you know, essentially a discount from the tax consequences when it's actually pulled out down the road, so that we can compare apples to apples. We can compare cash that's sitting in an account today to a 401k that's sitting there. Pensions are also a huge issue because pensions have to. The only way to truly value it is to get an actuary to tell us what the value is, and so pensions are a much bigger deal. Federal retirement, FERS. We've got all of these different military retirement. Retirement are so detailed because you've got some federal law, you've got state law, you've got, when was it accrued, how much has it grown? All of this comes into play for the retirement account analysis.
Yeah, and it feels like in this one particular, there's there's real expertise, knowledge that your attorney needs to put in because a lot of these you can see, well, it'll be 50-50. And then others will say, well, no, it's going to be this amount of money and this amount of money. And that can sometimes be different because what's the date? I mean, because these things are ongoing after the divorce.
Right. Yeah, and that is always a part of negotiation or something that needs to get ordered. Specifically, if like people have, say worked for 10 years prior to getting married, so the 401k has a premarital component and then the marital component. So all of that comes into play and has to get decided and dealt with. And then when you throw in a pension, with pensions, you've got to have to deal with what is going to be the value. Is there a survivor benefit? Is there not? Is there, like, there's so much that goes into it. So that's where, there's no way to kind of blanket it per type of account. It's just when we get into a case, we have to look at what accounts are there and then determine, what do we need to do to value them.
Yeah, which makes you kind of understand why it could be contested. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you got to put together. I mean, what if one client it really doesn't have that many short-term needs, but they feel their long-term needs they're had, or the opposite? I mean, seems like that even gets mixed in.
Yeah, and trading today's cash versus retirement and all of that plays into, a mediation or negotiation as well. But the most important part is just what are the values so that we can compare across different types of assets and property.
Yeah. And just finally on this, the whole idea of you were talking about, is it marital asset? Is it not marital asset? Um, and can it sometimes be both? I mean, can it part of it be marital and part of it be non-marital?
Yeah, and that's what we do a lot of times. So, like in a situation where, my previous example of work for 10 years, have the 401k, get married, the marital portion can be valued and can be defined, and that part gets divided. Then at the end of the case, then once we know what that number is going to be, then the parties would do what's called a quadro to be able to split that account so that there aren't tax consequences when that happens.
Yeah.
So that's how we deal with the premarital versus marital portion.
Yeah. But it makes sense then that it's not something that you just want to, say, yeah, let's do it this way without really digging into any of it. So that totally makes sense. Now, the second one, which is interesting, is the marital home. And there's this sort of truism that, you know, you hear, okay, what are you going to get? The marital home or the retirement? It's almost like they battle each other, but the marital home by itself can be, pretty complex to get figured out, get done, and on this one, it's got to maybe get sold.
Right. Yeah, and that's so again, valuation is always a question if it's not going to market where the somebody, a buyer out in the world is going to tell us what they're willing to pay for it. The division itself can be complicated, especially if somebody's trying to buy the other person out. You've got, a lot to think through with from the standpoint of you have the mortgage, you have the deed. The deed is the easy part from a legal standpoint, but the mortgage is the much more complicated one, especially in today's world where you've got interest rates that are higher than some people have had over the past few years, and if you are forced to do a refi or you're forced to sell, then your money's not going to go as far with a new home or with a new payment, and so all of that comes into play. So we have more and more people co-owning property after the divorce because they're waiting either for the market or they're waiting for the interest rates to come down and then do something. Well, that's all possible, and we can do that in a divorce. But there's just a lot more complications and a lot more things to work out, like who's required to deal with, repairs, who's required to make the payments, then what happens when it sells, how, what's the trigger for it selling. So there's so many things to think through when you're talking about a house. So we just want to, again, make sure that it's not where I think people get confused or get overwhelmed is they start to look at every piece independently of each other. Like what
Yeah.
you were saying is like, I've got the retirement account, I need to deal with that, but I also have the home. When in reality, it takes a little more work to get there, but we look at the entire picture. And because we're trying to equalize and we're trying to split out of as few pieces of property as we possibly can. So when we're doing the analysis and we're doing our spreadsheet for court or for mediation, it's really about what's the total value of everything so that we compare across different types of assets and then make the division as simple as possible, whether that's out of retirement or if that's out of the home. So that's where I see a lot of mistakes when people do their own divorces when they're dealing with the independent pieces. And so it's like, okay, we're going to split the retirement, we're going to sell, we're going to sell the house, or I'm going to get bought out of the house, and then I'm going to deal with the cars, and I'm going to deal with, well, yes, you can do it that way, but now you're spending money and you're taking time on each of those divisions. And so, that's where having some expertise and just knowing how this stuff works is important so that we can help to minimize those transfers, minimize the number of things that actually have to get dealt with. And that just saves time and saves money.
Yeah. I imagine that you probably get a lot of clients who have an attachment that's not financial to the house. There's obviously kids grew up there, they've lived there. I mean, that's a whole nother non-financial part that's even kind of in there. But also, you know, I've also seen where there's, if someone's getting full custody and they can say, well, I want the house because I'm the full custody and they're going to be here more and all of that. And so all of that can get kind of tossed in as well, can it?
Well, especially in like negotiations. When you get to a judge, though, a judge frankly doesn't care that much. The
Yeah.
judge is like, I don't want to see these people back in my courtroom again. And so if somebody can't prove to me that they can refi or they can get the other person off the house, I'm just ordering it sold because I don't want to have to deal with enforcement. I don't want to have to deal with modifications. I don't want to have to deal with all of the things that come with co-owning property after the fact. And so while all of these competing interests definitely, are something to think through during the negotiation phase, but what we have to tell clients and what clients need to know is that ultimately, if we end up in trial, the judge is just going to say who has the ability to refi or to buy the other person out, and that person is more than likely going to get awarded the ability to stay in the home, because it really comes down to dollars and cents at that point. So from a judge perspective, they want to take the easiest route to disentangle everybody. But there's definitely reasons to keep people in a house. It just has to make sense financially.
Yeah. Kind of an aside here, you brought up, the judge makes, the final decision and the judge makes a final decision, whatever it is. And you've talked about this before, comes out to be, you know, a decree, which is a judgment, and how important it is to have everything that you need to have into that judgment, because if it's not there, it ain't there. And it seems to me that these particular kind of items um, almost need to be contested to bring out the all of the issues to prevent them from happening 3 years from now.
Yeah, and because we can't change it after the fact. And
Yeah.
so, I've seen multiple. I saw one this week where the judgment just said, that the ex-spouse gets a certain amount of money out of the house when it sells. Well, there's no provisions on how to make it sell. There's no timeline for when it's supposed to sell. There's no terms. And so the challenge is that judges look at the document and says, well, the document only says this, so I can't enforce it. So then you have to go through a much more complicated process to actually deal with the house. So the
Yeah,
the biggest thing with all of these five is that I think there's tendency for people to think, oh, we'll be able to figure that out later. But the
exactly.
figure that out later turns into a 10 times the amount of money to deal with it up front.
Yeah,
And you have to think through when we hate each other, can we figure this out later?
yeah,
And the answer typically is no.
right.
And so hunting the question and the answer down the road just is set up for a phone call that I have all too often, which is, sorry, this is going to cost you $30,000-$40,000 to deal with now because it wasn't dealt with back at the time of the divorce when it could have cost $1,000 or $2,000 just to plan for it. And so it just has a lot of ramifications because the courts have limited ability to go back and do something about
Yeah. I imagine that when it comes to businesses or interests in business, that getting it right the first time becomes even more important because, you know, that can be just crazy if you don't get it right the first time.
it. Businesses, by far, outside of kids, businesses are to me the most complicated, bring the most complicated issues to the table because like you said before, people have that sort of intrinsic value and that with the house. Businesses are even they bring that even more. So
Yeah,
there's the dollar and cents, but there's the feeling like this business is a child because you pour so much time and energy into it, that if you have to give it up or give pieces of it, it can be very difficult for people to wrestle with and deal with. But the reality is that it is an asset and it's an income source. So you've got
yeah,
all these different pieces of it that can cause complications. So business valuations are very subjective. Finding the right evaluator for the type of business is difficult. Not all evaluators are created equal, and so if you've got a dentist office, you need somebody who specializes in that type of valuation versus, if you have a real estate company or that sort of thing. So finding the right person to do it is a big part of it too. And then, getting a valuation, but that valuation is very different. You've got capital gains issues. You've got so many things that come into play. If you just put a valuation on a business and don't think through the future issues, then it can cause a lot of problems later.
oh yeah. And imagine that when both of the parties actually work in the business for the business, that can be especially difficult because does one party have to like quit?
Yeah, happens all the time. Um, and if they were underpaid in the business, then, or weren't paid in the business, then how does that work? And you've got, is there any deferred comp? Is there not any deferred comp? You've got a business that has been the lifeline for, and both parties put all of their time and energy and their work went into that, and that was the future. And then it's going to get divided, and there's going to be a buyout, and there's going to be potential spousal support ramifications from the valuation of the business. And then can the person who keeps the business, can they actually afford to do all of these things at the same time and keep the business afloat? Like it's really important
Yeah.
to do it the right way.
Oh my God, that just, reminded me of, what happens in just in general when one of the spouses is sort of the unpaid worker. And, there's the mechanics that make up for that. And in this case, that I mean, it seems like that could happen. I mean, one of the parties works and takes all the income, and the other one just works for them and maybe takes no income.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then, yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of fun things that go along with businesses. So we we have to be, very intentional and just get the information so that we're actually doing it the right way.
yeah, yeah. The fourth one, which is sort of the, sidestep from the first one, which was retirement accounts, which have, not just the value, but that whole retirement aspect, but just regular investment portfolios. A lot of them are taxed differently, a lot of them are treated differently, a lot of them, come pay differently. That's got to be an issue.
Yeah, all the time because the especially every type of account is so different. Are we dealing with short-term capital gains, long-term capital gains? What are the gains? Trying to figure out the
Yeah,
basis and all the different, stocks that are held or, what have you in what these investments are can be extremely challenging. That's why getting the right person involved to help value it and tell us what those different values are super important. I just had a case recently where one of the parties had made large gains in the stock market in a short period of time. Well, the result is, yeah, that's great, and that's great. You make large gains in the stock market, but the reality is that the tax bill for that year was going to be massive. And if you don't take that into consideration because you're not thinking about it, then there's going to be a big surprise at the end of the year when there's a tax bill of, in this instance, it was over $250,000. Like that's a big deal if it's not dealt with the right way.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so that's just something where I think the biggest takeaway with these and through the personal property that we'll talk about next is really just getting the right people involved to give the information so that we can really compare the values across multiple types of assets.
yeah, yeah. One thing that I, I I hear people ask is and talk about is, you know, it- really on these is let's say you've got a $100,000 IRA and it's cooking along, and you've got $100 piece of land, um, or you know, does the future value of, even though they're both 100,000 now, the future value of one may be very different than the future value of the other, and that's gotta add some complexity.
Yeah, more from a negotiation standpoint, because once you end up in trial, the definition is date of divorce is the valuation. So you have to have that, and we're going to base the division off of the date
Right.
of the divorce. So but it definitely comes into play when we're negotiator trying to mediate.
Yeah. The uh, the negotiating you talked about really, I think, you know, comes in because on these kinds of things, again, there's still that separate and marital property and who's investing in what, and who brought in what, and that all has to be, again, put into the negotiation.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you go
Yeah.
into then you go into things like hard assets like cars, you know,
Yeah.
gold. It becomes even more difficult because you have to do historical appraisals, and so that becomes even more challenging. Like it's
Yeah.
you know the you know the reality is that somebody has to tell us what something's worth, and so we have to be able to go get those valuations.
Yeah. Yeah. And that gets to that personal property. It may seem easy. Okay, you take, your jewelry, I'll take my jewelry, you'll take your car, I'll take my car. But, you know, as the value of those things, especially if they're high value, um, that can become a little more tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you get the family sentimental part of it too. It's, just, what is the value? How important is it to somebody to keep, and then using that to, be able to trade assets around. So,
Yeah, yeah,
I would say that you know, the personal property, really requires a good appraiser and getting those valuations so that we can deal with them.
yeah. Yeah. The it feels sometimes like in even high asset, divorces, some personal property that is not particularly shouldn't be considered that important gets a tremendous overimportance because one party just says, no, I this is mine. And it can really gum up the works when someone just doesn't want to sign, the negotiation until they get that particular thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and because then it's not about the math, it's about the that sentimental value, and so we
Yep.
see
Yep.
that all the time, and just have to work through that.
Uh, just an offshoot, I was kind of looking through stuff and Bitcoins are big now, or they're getting bigger. Um, are they treated more like investments or like personal property? I mean, you talked about gold and things like that, which are sort of a cross between personal property and investments.
Yeah. Um, I mean, the way I look at it is that it feels more like an investment account to me because you've got, the volatility that comes with it. Whereas typically with personal property, you don't have quite as much volatility. And so, you kind of, but you still have to get a value. But that one, you can have valuations change so dramatically
Yeah.
that it can be, it's just important again, in a week, could you lose thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars or thousands of dollars? It's all possible, right? So, it's just a matter of putting it on the balance sheet and then being able to divide it appropriately.
Yeah. It's funny. There's a case I know of going on right now where the judge is needing to decide on personal property items that they both are attaching, historical and sentimental value to, and it's coming down, and they're not agreeing. And this thing is coming down to having the judge decide, you know, who is this most, has the most personal connection to this. And that's not a place you want to put the judge, like you said, is it?
No, you can avoid it. That's not a good use of time and money for sure.
Yeah, really. Wow. Well, those are the five. Those, and we could talk about some others, but those definitely, I think, are the big five that are contested the most and really need um good attorneys to get their clients through the most.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, look, Louis, thank you. Thank you for sitting down to talk with us today about these five important, most contested assets in a divorce. And it was just great. You break it down to where people can understand why it is and how it is. So thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to contact our firm. We can get you connected